León, buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a la rueda de prensa de la película GRAN FELLOVE, que se proyectará en proyección especial dentro de la sección oficial de esta 68 edición del Festival de San Sebastián. Y bueno, para hablar de la película tenemos aquí a parte de su equipo, que presento a continuación. Tenemos a Carlos Rossini, director de fotografía, Carlos Sosa, productor, Cristina Velasco, productora también, y a su director, Matt Dillon, que es un placer tenerla aquí de nuevo en San Sebastián. Así que muchas gracias por estar aquí y podemos pasar ya directamente a las preguntas. Así que quien quiera preguntar, por favor, levante la mano y le pasamos un micrófono. Sí, ahí tenemos una pregunta.
Hi, there, I'm here. Hi. I need to do the obvious question, how all this came up and why this particular figure you chose to do a film about?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was really a very organic process, the way it came to be. I didn't really set out to make a documentary about him. It just sort of evolved. And where it really began was way back in the last century, the end of the last century, 1999, when I discovered his music. And I introduced it to the music to a very good friend of mine who was somebody that I'd say that it really was born out of that friendship that we had and that bond that we had over the same type of music. And that's where it all began. I told him about Fellove, and then he went and made a record with him. He found him at 77 years old, this kind of semi-retired, incredible performer who was living in Mexico City in exile from Cuba since 1955, really. And I was very pleasantly surprised that he actually tracked him down, and then, you know, we started talking, and next thing you know, I was there with him filming the making of that last record of Fellove. So that's where it all began, and then it wasn't really sure what to do with the footage. Although I thought it was amazing because he was amazing, and he was just a joy to be around. It's such a colorful. It's like the kind of person that walks down the street and your head turns because he's such a kind of it's this exuberant musical personality. And I knew it was great, but I didn't know exactly what to do with it, and so therefore it sat for a while. And maybe that was a good thing to a certain extent, but. That's the way it all came to be. And then, of course, it wasn't until many years later that I jump-started the project, and really with Carlos Sosa here. Carlos and I met. Actually, he reminded me. We first met here in Spain, in Albacete, and I said to him. I said, "You're Mexican."
2008.
Was that long ago? And I said, "Do you know Fellove? What happened that we're there?" And then we met later in Guadalajara and talked about it some more.
Bueno, nos conocimos en una cena con Barry Gifford y con Ray Loriga, y de pronto les presento al mexicano. ¿Tú eres mexicano? Sí. ¿Tú conoces a Fellove? Yo no tengo la menor idea quién es Fellove. Entonces se me quedó ahí la cuestión de Fellove, y luego nos vimos en Guadalajara y volvimos a hablar del tema, pero fueron 2 años después que nos vimos en Nueva York. Yo ya era socio con Cristina, donde empezó. It was 2 years later, after we met in Guadalajara. I was partners with Cristina already, and we saw in New York City.
Yeah. And, you know, and it was just sort of process, and at that time, I had sort of, you know, the idea of the film evolved, and so the discovery happened in the process of making the film. And at one time, at that point, I knew the film was going to include this incredible footage of Fellove and everything, but that it would maybe be about the bigger picture of Cuban Cubans immigrating to Mexico, this story that really hadn't been told. And then, of course, when I got to Mexico after all this time, it became clear that that story was the story of El Gran Fellove. And then it became very clear that that was our story, you know. And so, I mean, I'll just tell you a little bit like about that part of it was that I had asked Carlos, I said, hey man, I know he's living in a home, but I don't know where could you find him. And then he was able to find him and met him. And he was very old. And I knew I wouldn't film him in that particular state that he was in. But, you know, I know that he'd been asking about me. And when I say that state, his health had deteriorated. He was getting quite old. You know, he was 89 and he had health issues, you know, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things like this. And so Carlos found him there, and he reached out to me and said, hey, I found him and he remembered you, right? I mean, what
You want me to tell you the story?
Yeah, sure, you go ahead.
Estaba en un asilo de ancianos y llegué al asilo y pedí verlo y me dijeron que era imposible verlo. Entonces yo dije, bueno, pues no lo puedo ver. Entonces, bueno, gracias, hasta luego. Me iba yendo y con una enfermera le dije, oye, déjame verlo. Y la enfermera me pasó por la puerta de atrás y me metí a verlo y ya estaba muy viejo, ya estaba con demencia senil. Y me acerqué y le dije, soy amigo de Matt Dillon, va a venir, te manda saludos. Y empezó a temblar y los ojos se le empezaron a poner brillosos. Y empezó a decir, Marilyn, Marilyn, Marilyn. Y a los 3 días llegó Matt, le hablé y hablamos, Cristina y yo con Matt, esto tiene que ser ya. Y llegó.
Yeah. And so by the time when I got down there, because Carlos told me that he's not doing too well, so if you want to see him, which I did, you better come quick. So I got down there, and you know, he'd been living in a really interesting place. It was called the Casa de Actor, and it was created by Cantinflas, who decided to start this actor's home when he saw actors that he knew from television panhandling in front of the theater. And he became alarmed and said, I have to do something for my fellow actors. So Fellove had been living there for about 5 years. But when I got down there, because of his deterioration of his health, he got moved to the regular hospital. And, you know, and that was a very, you know, it was difficult, you know, to have that. But I did do some interviews with some of the people who experienced this time with the Cubans in exile and the Mexican musicians working together. And they all spoke about Fellove, you know. And that's when it became very clear to me that that was what this film was. It was his journey. And that journey became a porthole, a doorway into the history, that history. Yeah.
Tenemos ahí una pregunta.
Peter Hood, German television. A question to Matt Dillon. In the beginning of the film, you talk about your fascination for Cuban music and your desire to collect kind of rare records and discover people. Could you tell us a bit more how this all started? I mean, this is not the conventional American musical taste. So how did you get into this?
American.
But how did you get into this special appreciation of this kind of music exactly, which was not following kind of the great names, but discovering new people?
Well, you know, again, since I was 12 years old, I always bought records. I didn't think of myself as a record collector, but more somebody that just liked music. And, you know, my musical tastes evolved, and I developed curiosities about music. And being in New York is, I mean, it's, you know, a big Latin community, lots of Afro-Cuban music, Puerto Rican music, salsa. This is one of the great cradles of this kind of music. And So eventually when I did discover that music, because it was around me and everywhere, and when it hooked me, I really became, I wasn't really interested in any other kind of music. I'm being honest about it. I mean, of course, I love all kinds of music, but Cuban music especially hooked me. And I didn't set out to become like a record collector or something. It's just something that happens because, Willie tells you about, in Queens, tells you about Salam in the Bronx, and he's got these records and he wants to sell them, and you go and you want to buy 2 records, and he says, I only want to sell the whole collection. And you're like, okay. So you end up amassing these, and you become a collector. And then you discover that sometimes the only way to find it is on record, And then it becomes fun. It becomes the hunt, Yeah.
Tenemos allí al fondo otra pregunta. Sí, aquel chico de azul. Sí. Sí.
Oh, hi, a couple of questions for Matt Dillon from Rodrigo from Brazil. Matt, let me ask you something. 18 years ago, you directed an incredible movie, City of Ghosts. How useful was that experience in Fellove's documentary? And another question, how different is the New York City you filmed from today's New York City when we think about the Latin American artists that lives there?
Ooh, those are a few questions, and thank you. I'm really glad you liked the movie City of Ghosts that I made. And documentaries are tough. It's another creature, as Christina, Carlos, and Carlos Rossini, they can tell you. Carlos Rossini's in the middle of making one himself now, so I empathize with him. And I think the difference is really that you don't have the script. And one of my editors is here, Chompis, Armando Croda, and he could tell you, and Lindsay, they both worked on the film. You really are, your script it's in the material that you have. And it's really, it's difficult. And, finding the balance. But obviously having had a lot of experience as an actor really helped me when I made City of Ghosts. So it wasn't as if I hadn't been on a movie set before. So it was a similar thing here, but it really, the documentary gets made in the editing room, but it gets made throughout. And I didn't understand that. So when I filmed in 1999, when I filmed this footage in 1999, it never occurred to me, that I could have gone back and that I can go back. And that's what the beauty of making a documentary is. You don't need a big team. You don't need, you could go Rossini and I, we went and did one interview. We went to Merida in Mexico just to do an interview with one artist, Tony Camargo, and that's the way that's how it developed for me. And I think we are in a golden age of documentaries. Documentaries are very much often as exciting, if not more exciting, than the narrative films. And I'm an actor, so I don't mean to but I have to say I find it to be the case. And so, this journey that we took, and I really love that it's these 4 guys, these 3 people with me here right now, because we were there together when we started on this project, when we jump-started this project back in whenever it was, 2013 or whatever.
12.
No sé si Carlos y Cristina a lo mejor quieren añadir algo a lo que estaba comentando.
Bueno, que fue padrísimo aprender del trabajo de Matt, de la manera de cómo se acerca a sus personajes. Fue un poco intimidante todo el conocimiento que tiene sobre los personajes, sobre la música, sobre la historia de Cuba, sobre la historia de México, sobre la historia. Entonces había como muchas capas de conocimiento que se juntaban entre ellas mismas a la hora de acercarse también a los personajes. Recuerdo muy bien que, perdón, Matt de repente tenía fotos que encontraba ya sea por medio de research o de fotos que le facilitaban otros personajes o músicos. Y se sentaba y me decía, él es fulano de tal. y hizo no sé qué. O sea, me hablaba de toda la gente de las fotos y luego agarraba otra foto y sabía quiénes eran todas estas personas y cómo se habían conocido y en qué fecha habían hecho qué cosa. Pero también lo decía con una familiaridad y una naturalidad, como si alguien te abre el álbum de fotos de su familia y te está contando cómo crecieron estas personas. Entonces hay un acercamiento muy bello, muy cálido, que creo que le da ese toque de familiaridad. Creo que el tratamiento del documental es un tratamiento que no tiene un approach del experto al que no sabe, sino es más bien como yo te voy a contar una historia de algo que siento y que vivo y que creo que te puede apasionar, y eso es por medio de la vida de Fellove, y creo que Matt logró hacer algo muy bello en el cual sepas o no de música, sabes de las batallas de la vida, las batallas de los artistas, ¿no? Entonces creo que es una pieza muy empática y que pues, para mí fue un gusto poder contribuir en algo.
Y no sé, Carlos.
Well, I remember Christina, I mean, one of the things that I had when I was with Fellove, right, in 1999, and I loved him. He was a joy to be around. But I would say to him, listen, I need some materials from you about your past, because I only had a handful of records to go on, you know, that he had made. And, you know, he gave me some color Xerox of the record covers. That was about it. Because he had all that material, but it didn't mean anything to him, because he was a future-thinking guy. I mean, when some of his contemporaries were doing Buena Vista Social Club revival material, he wanted to go out and make a rap record, you know? He wanted to do different things. And then when I got down there, you know, and I met the woman who became his manager, she said, Matt, you've got to come. I have all this material of him. And Christina and I went down, and she had in the attic was this dusty boxes of photographs and letters from his family and sheet music and everything. And it was like, there was this revelation. And I said, if I'd only had this material earlier. And it was really an interesting moment. I don't think my lungs recovered from all the dust we inhaled.
And would you say, Matt, that somehow from discovering that luggage, I think it was an old luggage full of letters and pictures and records, and you kind of rewrote part of the documentary from that information, right?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I had always had, because when Fellove spoke to me about this man, and I know maybe you're not that familiar with the most incredible bolero composer and singer, Jose Antonio Mendez, who was, you know, from his account, was somebody that was very important person, like an important friend. And then when I was able to see the letters and pictures, that was the man who brought him to Mexico. And I knew that relationship was important. And there were the pictures of them. And I hadn't seen them. And, you know, so listen, I'm a bit of a nerd. You know, I love gathering information. But, you know, I will say that I learned something about, and this goes back to the gentleman from Brazil's question about the difference in making documentaries and feature films, is that information is palatable to audiences when you feel for the people that you're telling a story about. And so that was the approach, became emotion first, the man, the person, and then people they're all in. They're going to want to know about the history, the music, the data, the information, but you have to really feel a connection for the people.
No sé si Carlos Rossini quiere añadir algo a todo esto.
Nada, que desde que hablamos, no era 2013, 2012, diciembre, en una cena con Barry también en Los Cabos. Fue increíble porque empezamos a hablar, yo acababa de estrenar una película, nos sentamos a hablar y no paramos de hablar en horas. Y entonces me empieza a contar la historia de Fellove y yo decía, no puede ser, es como si está hablando de algo que pasa en este momento, y esa sensación de presente fue totalmente clara para pensar que era una película que se tenía que contar sobre mucho que había pasado en una sensación de presente, y creo que tiene que ver mucho con lo que preguntaba el periodista de Brasil. Esta idea de cómo cuentas una historia, y el trabajo de cámara de City of Ghosts y el trabajo de cámara de esta película hacen que todo el tiempo lo estés viviendo, y a mí me metió en un viaje con la música y en un viaje con la cámara para trabajar en muchos lugares, lo cual estaba increíble. incluso en competencias fotográficas en el set.
Muy bien. Tenemos aquí otra pregunta, esta señorita.
Yeah, I remember you asking for a focus puller. I could use a focus puller.
Yeah, I would love that.
Bueno, enhorabuena porque es maravilloso que podáis hacernos conocer cosas tan divinas como esta. Quería preguntar a raíz de las energías que se dieron durante la grabación del disco, porque es curiosísimo esa lucha de egos, Chocolate, Fellove, o sea, tú además estabas allí, que realmente creo que era una ventaja que Fellove no te conociera como tal, como el actor internacional que eres. Y sobre todo, pues, qué tipo de energías se dieron, porque en la película es fantástico todo lo que ahí se puede ver. Gracias.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, literally when I arrived, there was a group of young people. We're all just like excited to meet this guy because we all were familiar with his music, and Joey had put together a super group of young Cuban musicians, and living in Mexico City. So they took the same journey Fellove did all these years later. And when he came, he was just so accommodating to everybody because he was just so he hadn't made a record in 20 years. And here he was going to be rehearsing for this first experience that he had. And he was accommodating to me and to the cameraman, but he had no idea who I was. He just thought I was part of the crew and that he was there to prepare for his record. And I was the guy getting in the way. You know, I was just like, well, he's a nice guy, but who is this guy? He thought I was part of the crew, you know, the cable wrangler kind of thing. And then people told him that actually, no, he's a big fan of your music, and he's the one who introduced Joey to the project. And then he developed these expectations that maybe this was going to be this renewed interest in his career. And, you know, this is not somebody who he had the spirit of a child, you know, like, I mean, a very serious man. I mean that. He was a very serious guy. But when he walked in the room, I mean, it was just this exuberance, joy, and musicality coming from him. But I think in 1999, Buena Vista Social Club had just come out. And those people were his peers. I mean, Omara, they came up together. In fact, he was probably a little bit older. He was part of that feeling movement, but he was a senior guy. He was one of those innovators then, you know, and he wasn't, you know, but he had left in '55. So in many ways, this film is about those who left. Maybe if we look at Buena Vista Social Club, or the people who stayed behind, and we get to, you know, and these were people that left, you know, and I really became, that journey was really interesting to me. So, but the dynamic, going back to the thing you said about the recording, it was difficult because he hadn't done it for 20 years, and he was rusty, and there was tension because there was not that much time or that much money to get everything done in one day. And his talent isn't something you can harness very easily. So in the rehearsal, everything was very loose and free. Joey and he were connected very close together. It was the way he worked so well improvisationally. And then the technical stuff starts to take over in the recording studio. So that took a little while, but I remember the breakthrough. And the breakthrough's in the film with, it's called Descarga, it's called Descarga, it was California Jam Session. California Jam Session. He just came alive, and everybody was, I mean, it was like, and then after that, he was on his way, and it was like unstoppable. I mean, there's little pieces of what he did with me on the street, and he would go for a half an hour. If I told him to do a mambo, I mean, he was a one-man orchestra. He was showing you the arrangement, and it tells me, without a doubt, his greatest performances, and there's some good ones in this film, his greatest performances were probably never captured because he was performing all the time, you know, and it was just music was just coming out of him, you know. Yeah.
Tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta. Este caballero aquí que había pedido... Sí.
Hola, buenas. Mi pregunta va dirigida a Matt. Primero de todo, felicidades, porque creo que se refleja muy bien el espíritu tan libre de este fascinante hombre. Mi pregunta es algo más personal y quería preguntarte si guardas algún recuerdo o alguna conversación en particular, supongo que habrá muchas, pero alguna en particular que tuvieras con Fellove que sigas rememorando durante, bueno, hasta el día de hoy. Gracias.
You know, for me, as I had said earlier, when he shared, well, you know, he shared with me things about his background of being black in Cuba, you know, at that time. You know, the discrimination that existed there. And, you know, and he shared that with me. In fact, that he said, I'm 100% black. My background is African, and you know, he talked a little bit about how difficult that was at times because there was a degree of racism then. And not just that, but he also talked about the style of, there was that. And then the other personal things that I remember was him talking about how he wasn't readily accepted. Of course, by his colleagues in the feeling movement, the other artists, but by the mass public, the feeling, and the majority of those artists, they weren't really accepted right away in the beginning. And that's why so many of them left to go to Mexico. And Mexico was the trampoline for success. And discrimination didn't exist there in the same way, in any way that I mean, I'm sure, listen, the world is round, okay? But they were accepted, and I think that is reflected by the artists that I spoke to who were there. And I remember there were a lot of things in interviews that I couldn't put into the film, but Dandy Beltran shared with me a story about how in the 50s, he and the great composer and comedian Zamorita were both black, Afro-Cubano, you know, and they went to a nightclub in Havana, and they were turned away because they were black. And Tintin was with them, the great Mexican comedian. Tintin became so angry, and he argued with them, with the doorman, and then as they walked away, he said, I'm bringing you guys to Mexico because this not going to exist for you there. You know, you'd be accepted. And that's the experience that I found, the artists who lived there. It was harder, I think, for the artists that did come from abroad in Mexico when they got older, like Fellove, especially the ones who had no family, you know. I think that was tougher. So, but in general, they were accepted with great kindness in Mexico. That was what was shared with me by Fellove and others, yeah.
Okay. Bueno, lamentablemente estamos encantados de escuchar a Matt Dillon y al equipo de la película, pero tienen una agenda bastante apretada ahora y la proyección de la película luego. Así que sencillamente me gustaría agradecerles muchísimo su presencia aquí y desearles muchísima suerte con la película. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Gracias.